Today, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret destination that will change everything about Web3 forever. I wanna welcome you to the Modular Playground. So reality is, this is the current party you're at. It's a really sad party. There's a separation between the application and the core developers. Historically, in blockchain, there's no bridging and interaction between application and core developers when it comes to building application and infrastructure in blockchain. And by the end of this talk, you'll be able to come here. So this is where I'm at right now. This is like a really great party where application and core developers can mingle, and there's like less of a gap between both. In this talk, we're gonna cover the status quo on blockchain architecture, the communities that support those applications, and developers that use them. We will also cover how blockchain architecture changing in community structure and the developer skill set. So historically, this is how things were in blockchain. We have what you call a monolithic blockchain. So monolithic blockchain combines consensus and execution in one layer. So my experience for the past 5 years in Devrel and crypto has been with monolithic blockchain. For example, the work I did with Ethereum Classic, with Celo, with Ethereum through Flashbots or the EEA or Hyperledger. The EVM and Ethereum-based networks are monolithic blockchains. Execution and consensus are one layer in a monolithic architecture. So that leads to a separation. So if you see, there's a separation between application and core developers. Application developers, they focus on building their dApps, deploying their smart contracts, they're looking for that RPC node and some testnet tokens to deploy their smart contracts. Core developers, they focus on the consensus and execution. So they care about the network itself, that the network is producing blocks, and they work on the EVM as an example of an execution layer or other execution layer. So you see there's a separation between both. Another thing I want to introduce you to is communities as it is today in Web3 are what we call network-first communities. So a network-first community is a community in Web3 that aligns on the values of a network. Like for example, here at ETH Denver, we're here for Ethereum. We're aligning on the values of Ethereum. Core developers in these communities care about a lot of historical things that happen in a network. Like a great example is the merge in Ethereum. In Cosmos, people align around the Cosmos community. Same with Polygon and Solana. So historic evolution of monolithic architecture. So Bitcoin introduced what we call the app chain era when Satoshi published the Bitcoin white paper. And you can see examples of app chains like Bitcoin and Monero. Vitalik published the Ethereum white paper and introduced what we call the monolithic era, where Vitalik added execution to the consensus layer, and that's what we have, the EVM. It changed everything because it allowed us to deploy applications on top of the blockchain. But naturally, this has led to a gap in blockchain architecture. So monolithic scalability is actually linear. So there's a linear relationship between throughput and the amount of nodes that you're running. And that actually turned out that transaction fees actually increased linearly over time. There's another thing that I want to point out. There's a disconnect between application and core developers. Let's say I'm an application developer. I want to benefit from improvements to my execution environment. I can't because the execution environment is owned by the core developers. Now, on the core developer side, core devs tend to prioritize the network over the execution environment, but for good reason, because the network has to continue producing blocks. You got to improve the network throughput and other things, but that takes priority over the execution environment. So an application developer cannot really direct how the execution environment can go, and the core developer tend to deprioritize the execution environment over consensus. So one great tweet that I really, really love that kind of highlights the lack of ownership of application developers over the protocol. So Hayden Adams, the CEO of Uniswap, posted this tweet: every time an airdrop or NFT mint takes up the block space, I'm reminded that it's not that hard to parallelize execution of transactions that don't touch the same storage slot. Now, what does he mean? It doesn't matter what he's looking for. It could be parallel execution. It could be account abstraction. It could be anything that the application developer wants. The problem is Hayden has no control over the protocol. The protocol is controlled by the core developers. So another problem that you see is execution environment diversity. So in a network-first community, there's a political alignment around the values of a network to align around that execution environment. So in Ethereum, the alignment is always around the EVM. Solana is around the SVM, Cosmos is CosmWasm, and Sui is around MoveVM. Now, there is no, if I'm an Ethereum core dev and I think that Solana, Rust smart contracts are cool, politically, I can't really exercise or energize that kind of passion because I'm politically aligned with the EVM. So this is what we if you want to visualize this problem as a playground, imagine a monolithic playground is a playground with one slide. There's no other game in that playground. There's no abundance of fun that you can have. There's that one slide. And that slide would represent that execution environment. It's basically the EVM as an example, or specifically SVM for Solana. So that's a terrible reality, right? I mean, there's no diversity. I can't play around with different toys or different execution environment because I'm limited by the network I'm part of. So it turns out modular blockchains actually close that gap that we're seeing before. And let's find out how they do that. So the evolution toward modular architecture. We started with AppChain era with Bitcoin introduced by Satoshi. We covered Ethereum introduced the monolithic era with Vitalik's white paper. Celestia introduces what we call the modular era with Mustafa al-Bassam's white paper, the lazy ledger, being published. Now let's talk about modular blockchains. So an overview of modular blockchain is simple. Modular blockchains separate execution from consensus. Now, if you remember from the monolithic slide, execution and consensus are one layer. But here, what we're decided to do is separate execution from consensus. This allows us to do a lot of great things, where on the consensus layer, validators don't have to execute transactions, they just have to order transaction. And execution is where all the transactions get verified, and they can be verified by different rollups. So example of different modular blockchain. So currently Ethereum is going toward the modular architecture with EIP 4844, and that's a great thing to see because that will help scale Ethereum a lot more significantly than the current model of monolithic. Celestia, where I work at, provides the first modular blockchain architecture and introduces what we call a data availability layer. Polygon Avail is a solution, a DA layer solution for Polygon. And finally, we have EigenLayer with their EigenDA solution, which is also another form of modular blockchain. So my journey to this promised land. So my experience has been mostly EVM, right? So I played around with Hardhat, with Truffle, with like Foundry. I built smart contracts and like applications that allowed me to really experience Solidity, right? But I always because I'm in Devrel, I like to play around with different technology, right? So I want to play around with Cosmos. I want to play around with Solana. I want to play around with Move, Fuel. That lack of diversity in execution environment for me has always been limiting to me because I had to work mostly with one execution environment, EVM. So I don't know if you guys ever watched Tron Legacy, it's my favorite movie, but there's one quote that kind of really highlights my discovery of modular blockchain when I joined Celestia. And it's, I kept dreaming of a world I thought I'd never see. Then one day, I got in. And that's kind of the feeling, when you got into that modular paradigm, it showed me that there's an abundance of different execution environments that I can work with at any given time. So this creates a new and better reality for blockchain architecture and for the application and core developer. So with scalability in a modular blockchain, actually transaction costs, as the transactions increase, the fees actually, relatively stabilize over time because of the thing that we call data availability sampling. In data availability sampling, you can run a light node that scans 1% of the block to verify up to 99.99% accuracy what is included in that block. So in other words, you don't have to download the whole block. You can just sample less than 1% of that block. Customizability. Now this is a really important core value for me. In customizability, with modularity, I can select the execution environment that I want to play with. Cosmos, EVM, Fuel. I can select the kind of sequencer I want to use, a centralized or a decentralized sequencer or a sequencer as a service. I can select what kind of rollup I want to use, whether it's a sovereign rollup or a settlement rollup. And from proofs, I can select whether I want it to be no proof, so like a pessimistic rollup, a fraud proof if it's optimistic, ZK proof if I'm a ZK rollup. And another core value that it introduces is something that we call sovereignty. So you as a developer, if you're an application developer playing around in Solidity, you have no control over your execution environment. That is owned by the core devs. And what modularity introduces is full control over the stack for your application, from your smart contract all the way to the execution environment. And it turns out that can create what we call a modular playground, where there's an abundance of different games that you can play in this playground. If you want to play with Fuel, or with the EVM, or with Cosmos, you can do it any way you want. You can build a rollup in Fuel that settles on Ethereum. You can build a rollup that, like a Solana-based rollup that settles on Ethereum but takes data availability from Celestia. The combination of different modular toys that you can combine together is infinite. So going back to the example about Hayden. Hayden said, I wish there's parallel execution in the EVM. It benefits Uniswap. Now, if I was Hayden, how would I solve that problem? In a monolithic world, I say, hey, I want my application to take advantage of parallel execution. I create an EIP, I submit the EIP, and I beg and advocate to the core devs to include it in a future network upgrade. And I hope that works, but that takes a lot of advocacy from it. So in this example, it would take me a very long time to have new changes adopted by the core dev that would benefit application developers. So what is the solution in a modular world? Simple. I pick an EVM version with parallel execution and I deploy it as a rollup. Done. How do I do that? I fork an EVM version that has parallel execution. Now, the EVM, you can see a lot of improvements in the EVM that is never adopted by Ethereum, but there are branches. So me, as an application developer, I can take a version of the EVM like, I want this version with parallel execution. Now, with a few lines of code, I can deploy it as a rollup, and as easy as deploying a smart contract. And then after that, I would deploy Uniswap on that rollup. And then finally, I can settle on Ethereum. And that's the promise that you can get with modular blockchains. So modular blockchain mark a new beginning and close the gap between app developers and core developers. If you want to visualize it, here's how you bridge the gap. Because we separated the execution layer from the consensus layer, application developers and core developers can focus on that medium layer separated for concern. So if I'm a core dev, I'm focused on the network, but I want to add parallel execution to the EVM. I can create a branch of it and deploy it. And now me as an application developer, I can take that branch and use it and deploy that rollup, and then deploy my smart contract and application on top of it and benefit from those improvements. So that is the promise. Before, there's a separation between application and core devs. But there's now what you're seeing with the modular era, they're transitioning into what we call rollup developers, where application developers can easily deploy a rollup, and core developers can actually do a lot of improvement on the execution layer without having to worry about a network upgrade. And then another symptom, like another effect of this, is network-based communities, what we covered before, become execution environment communities. So around Solana, for example, the SVM, you have network communities like Solana, people from Cosmos, people from Polygon, aligning around the SVM. You have in the EVM, Ethereum folks, Cosmos folks, and Polygon folks aligning around EVM. WASM, you have Cosm, WASM, and Solana and Ethereum communities aligning around that execution environment. So the alignment now is no longer around the network, but around the execution environment. So communities now align around values of the execution environment that matter to them the most. So this is a really great tweet by Zheng, the CEO of Optimism. She said, change now are the new smart contract. And that's the reality. You saw the announcement by Base. That's only the beginning of the tip of the iceberg. Now, you as an application developer, you deploying a smart contract is now you able to deploy your own rollup and then deploy your smart contract. And that's the reality that you're gonna head to. It might sound scary, but actually the tools available to you are so easy to use. So with a modular world, the playground becomes more abundant. You have more tools and toys to play with and deploy rollups. And as an application developer, you are you're taking a lot of the traits from core development as an application developer. And that's pretty exciting. And then, with that reality, everyone can come to this party where application and core developers can mingle and they become one. And with that, thank you so much. If you want to test out deploying rollups, scan the QR code. We have a tool called RollKit for deploying rollups. If you want to connect with me on Telegram or Twitter, Syaznator. And if you want to email me, syaz@celestia.org. And yeah, thank you so much.